I'm really glad to be here. This is new to me, but you look good. And I'm going to talk about Allensworth with the time frame of 1908 to 1918. And that covers the period of time when Allensworth was in its heyday, and also when my family had history and lived in Allensworth. And basically, I'm going to give you a little information about the Colonel, but I'm going to end with my family. And before you leave, I would like for you to also look at the beautiful display that Mary Ann Relaford has put on the table with the help of Mr. Cornell and, what's your name? Brian. And Brian and a couple of other people. All right. Allensworth. Well, you heard a little bit about it, but I want to let you know that Allensworth was more than just a train stop on the Santa Fe Railroad in the southern part of Tulare County. It was more than the largest granary deposit in the West Coast, and also it was a holding area for the cattle. And this is where most of your economic monies came from, the work that they had, because these trains were the only trains that supplied this kind of granary on the West Coast, and it's located, like, you know, let me start. This town was located in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley. And this town was a planned community. It wasn't a place where some families said, oh, this looks good, we're going to stop here and live a while, and then other people started living there. No. One of the reasons Allensworth was successful was because it was planned. This was the dream that Colonel Allensworth had, where people could live in dignity, and even though segregation was still legalized, and many soldiers, business proprietors, homemakers, homeowners, and farmers from many different areas of California came to settle this town in the United States. And what they wanted to do was to contribute their skills and their professions to build a town of Allensworth, California. Now, most people they have the idea that Allensworth was nothing but a farm town. No, that's not true. Yes, they did have farmers, but there were professional people there who had the bakery, the hotel, the livery. That's the area where the blacksmiths would be to shod the horses, because at that time they didn't have all these fancy cars. All I see parked all out there for the children to ride in today. They had the horse and the buggy, so that horses really had to be taken care of. And there was even a young, not a young man, but there was also a gentleman who raised what they call the Belgian rabbit, which at that time was used for its fur and made collars, jackets out of. So they were not all farmers, but like I said, they did have there were farmers in Allensworth. Well, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Colonel Allensworth. He was born into slavery in Louisville, Kentucky on April the 7th, 1842. He was the youngest of 13 children, and at that time there was no establishments for African Americans to really be educated. And Allensworth was Allensworth's mother had told him, why don't you play school with the master's son? And this was how Alan Allensworth learned how to read. Yes, they would play school. And when the massa found out that Alan Allensworth knew how to read, he jacked him up and sent him down the river. He sold him, and before he left, his mother gave him $1 silver that she had been saving. And she told him that, take this dollar and buy 2 things, a comb and a book. And one of the book that he bought was a speller, a little blue speller that most of the slaves used to improve their English and to learn how to read. And the other one was a comb, and it was Webster's spelling book. And the comb was to create room for great things in your mind, to let it go and make a new life. And the book was so he could learn and develop good things and be a person of integrity. Now, as depicted in the film, Colonel Allensworth had several things that he did for a living. He joined the U.S. Navy, and he was a steward there. Him and his brother even owned 2 successful businesses in Louisville, Kentucky. They were restaurants. One day, Alan Allensworth sold the business, and he went to school to get his credential, where he became a chaplain. He was appointed a chaplain. And in 1977, he had his master's and honorary degree. He married a lady called Josephine Level, and she was from Kentucky. She was a noted musician, and she was educated. They had 2 children, 2 daughters, Eva and Nella, N-E-L-L-A. Now these 2 girls did not live in Allensworth because the colonel he lived in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles area. And that's when he began to think about this freedom colony. Whereas in 1906, he retired from the Army with the rank of lieutenant. He was the highest ranking black officer in the United States at that time. And in 1908, he was highly favored because he wanted to find land and build homes, and he became the leader of the Allensworth community. At this point, I want to interject some things about my family where my granddaddy, named William Henry Bud Hall and Elizabeth Hall, they left their home out on Pacheco and South H in Bakersfield to come to live in Allensworth, to follow the dream, because my grandfather believed in education just like Colonel Allensworth did. And they were among the first families that came to the colony, and he had 13 children. And the picture of all of the girls are on the back wall back there. There were 2 brothers that lived, the other child was a stillborn. And Papa was glad to move up to Allensworth because it was a great place to live and raise his children. And I want to quote what my mother said about Allensworth. She says, he, talking about her daddy, wanted us to grow up in a place where we could have the best chance to succeed and have a good life. I'm glad he brought us to Allensworth because it was a great place to live, and I still consider that my hometown in my heart is Allensworth, California. And on the farm, for their living and for themselves, they raised pigs, cow, and Papa sold the milk because he had a separator. It would separate the milk from the cream, and he would sit the milk and cream out in front of this little building, and early in the morning the milk truck would come by and pick it up, and they never saw each other. But he got his money. They sent him this bill for the milk he had. Also, my grandfather was one of the first 3 persons to sign the Tulare County Board of Education for Allensworth School District in 1912. And there were about 280 families that lived in Allensworth at the heyday at this time. Also, my mother went to school at Allensworth in 1913. And I have an aunt that was the first girl baby born. Her picture is standing in the back there. She was the first baby born in Allensworth. And she was also a graduate from Santa Barbara Teachers College. Today, you know that to be the University of Santa Barbara. She got her teacher's credential there, and she came back to teach in Allensworth in 1935 to 1944. She got married, went to Hawaii for a couple of years, and came back and taught from 1951 to 1953. And there was also a man named Ed Pope who was one of her students. And he said that until when they moved to Allensworth, he used to have to fight his way from school to school and from home because he was the only black child that went to school in this all-white community. And when they moved to Allensworth, he said he didn't have to fight anymore. He had some friends for the first time, and he could concentrate. He really liked his teacher, which was Ethel Hall, my auntie. And the present schoolhouse that you see today was built in 1912, and before that, there was a little building that Miss Allensworth's mother had built for the schoolhouse. Then they took that schoolhouse and moved it to the present place where the Tulare Free Library is today. And a free library, you may have a lot of different definitions of what you think it is, but when I searched it out, a free library meant you didn't have to pay for an identification card like you do today, and it was free. You didn't have to even pay to check the books out or anything. Allensworth's library was the first voting poll place in Tulare County. Yes, and it was also the place that had a reading room. Now, most of the libraries only had a table and 2 chairs, and you need to have 50 books on the shelf. That was designated a library. But if you had a reading room, you had special privileges that you could order more books from the Tulare branch down at the town and supply your room with more literature and research. And the schoolhouse and the library were the two most, and the church were the 2 most important buildings when my mother and them grew up there. And it is like that today in most communities. The schoolhouse was an area where they taught you your ABCs, numbers, mathematics in the daytime, and in the afternoon and the evenings, the Glee Club would come and practice there and sing, and the Glee Club even traveled around the counties. They went to Visalia, Lindsay, all the little towns around here, and sang for monies. That's how they promoted monies to carry on the things at Allensworth. They also had box socials, and this was where the ladies would design a box, decorate it, but they had to cook a meal. You had to have the whole complete dinner, and you had to decorate it. And your boxes were auctioned off, and they were only auctioned off to the males because they were the ones that had to eat dinner with you with whatever you cooked. And so the boxes were auctioned off, and if you had an eye on one of the ladies there that you wanted to eat with, of course you put out more money so you could beat the other guy and you could sit and eat with her. Well, there was one young man, as they say, he wasn't easy on the eye, but he had the money. And the girls really didn't want to eat with him. He was a nice guy, but like I said, they just didn't want to eat with him, but he won out every time. He would buy more than one box, and sometimes he'd what he would do would give them to the families that were there. But that was one of their major fundraisers. And if you ever come to Allensworth and see the schoolhouse, it's divided into 2 large sections. On the right-hand side was where the classes met from 1st to the 8th grade, and on the opposite side was where, at the very beginning, where they would, if it was raining outside, they would use that section there to do their little games or whatever they were going to do. Then as more people came, they needed an area for the younger children. So the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade went on I'm facing the room backwards, but to my left of the building, which would be the south side, and then the older children would take the rooms on the north side. Now, I used to stay in Allensworth with my auntie before I was 6 years old, which is the legal age that the state says you must put your child in school. Many people don't know that you do not have to put your child in school until they're 6 years of age, and that law has not been changed. However, they do expect you to take part in Head Start and all the other government subsidies that they have for you, because research shows that they know when children are exposed to good education and consistent, they do well when they grow up like you're doing now. The other thing about the school, in that schoolroom is a picture of Lincoln and Booker T. Washington. And the significance of those 2 pictures is what happened in the air with Lincoln when he was going on that was so dramatic and useful to African Americans. You can look it up, and Oliver, you can ask them later, and Ms. Hart, you can ask them later to answer that question. Well, Lincoln at that time was president, and you'll find out what the significance of the relationship with Allensworth and that picture is through your instructors. The other thing is that Booker T. Washington's picture is important because that's where Colonel Allensworth got the idea that the children only go to the 8th grade here, and where are they going to go to get their college education? So he talked to Booker T. Washington, and Allensworth was supposed to have the second Tuskegee, Alabama College campus in Allensworth. It never came about because in Visalia, there's a case where these two people went to court and said that they did not want to have equal schools where the whites could be at one place and African Americans be at another. They wanted everybody to be able to have the same educational level. And that was a blow to the colonel because the general public said, well, we're just coming out of slavery and we're just beginning to be able to do things on our own without all of the prejudices and discrimination. And now you want to bring a higher ed school here. So through the legislature, it was voted down and the general public. And that is one of the reasons that that college did not flourish in Allensworth. My auntie was the first librarian in Allensworth. Her name was Ethel Hall Norton. She was the first librarian in Allensworth. And then I had an auntie named Miss Mary Vickers. She actually had the first general store in Allensworth, and she was the first postmaster. You don't call the ladies of the postmistresses, you call them postmasters. And she sold her store to Henry Singleton, and he built him a store across the street, which you will see the replica at as one of the museums there in Allensworth. So, let's see. I wanted to talk about quilts. Another activity at the school was women came there and they made quilts, and they would make quilts for new families that came into the town, and if they didn't have enough cover, the ladies would get together and make them a quilt. And that's a picture of my mother explaining to the photographer how she made quilts. The jacket that she has on, and she made this jacket by hand. And quilts tell stories. The original quilts were made from gunny sacks, any kind of material that could be put together with twill. And the inside of them, they used feathers, soft leaves, and that's what they used as pallets, because they didn't have beds like we sleep in today. The slaves slept on the floors, but that's how they were made. And say, for instance, what's your name, young lady?
Selena.
Say it.
Selena.
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 Selena. Say, for instance, Selena had a skirt that she no longer wanted, but the material was still good. And her mother would take that piece, the bottom piece or the best part of that skirt, and use it to make either some kind of pattern, or she just might have used it in a great big piece because she was tired and she didn't want to work hard to make this cover, and just sew it together so it would cover the bed, and put cotton or either other pieces of the shirt tails of her father and her brothers to fill it in to give her warmth. And we used to sit around and look at the quilts and talk about, oh, Tina, you remember that raggedy skirt you had and Mama tried to get you to throw it away and you wouldn't, and you found it in the quilt. But we would sit there and talk about our clothes that our mother had used. And the first quilt that my mother made was a 9-patch that's on display at the table in the back. Now, it's just a 9 pieces of material the same size. And that was her first quilt that she ever made. And then when she was older, Bakersfield College used to have an outreach program where they taught quilting. And that was Mary Ann's auntie that worked for Bakersfield College that had this quilting class. And those ladies really had some beautiful quilts. They called them samplers. And this is a 9-patch also, but the material is just turned a different way. It's still that same 9-patch. Instead of my mother lining them up like the patch there, she turned it and lined it up to make it look more like a diamond, more like a diamond. But quilting is another social that the women had, and they would either meet at the same time, just like people meet up for your meetings and things. They would meet there to do their own quilts. They found out that somebody was in need, they'd all get together and make quilts. So quilts were also another way to make friends and to keep friends, because that was another way that the people survived. Everybody there had a garden, my mother said. And say, for instance, Miss Ludicky may have had some of those little round green Spanish onions that I like, and I may have had a bushel or something of collard greens. Well, I could swap my collard greens for some of her onions that I liked so well. And that is what my mother said they did, because everybody didn't grow everything, but they knew where to go to get their beets, their carrots, and they always had something to trade off with them. So my mother and her sister Pauline said that when they would go to church, the minister would try to get them to join church because they needed to go to heaven. And my mother said they would say, "What is he talking about?" I said, "We don't need to join church because we got heaven right here with Allensworth." Because the preacher was talking about in heaven how the water flowed freely. There were 3 artesian wells in Allensworth at that time. 2 large ones, and a smaller one out in the farm area. The birds chirped all the time in the trees, just like they did in heaven, he said. And the water flowed freely. So they said, what do we need to go to heaven for? We got heaven right here in Allensworth. And that, they would always talk about that. And the name of the song was Beulah Land, beautiful, beautiful Beulah Land. But it told about the same thing that the preacher would be preaching about. And she said they never did join church. No, she said that when they would ask them to come up, they said, we don't need to. And they really did like Allensworth. Let's see, what else did I told you about Miss Vickers having the first grocery store. And Mr. Pope, I need to tell you a little bit about him. He was the gentleman that saw Well, first, the jacket that Mary Ann had, it's also in the book of Miss Royal's, The Freedom Colony. It's on page 67 for reference if you just want to hook up the real jacket with the written material. But Mr. Pope is the person who I would say was really responsible for Allensworth being a state historic park. He's the gentleman that loved my auntie Ethel Hall, because he said the math that she taught him at Allensworth was what he used every day at his job at Sacramento, because he worked for the state as a draftsman, and he used everything he learned in Allensworth on his job. The other thing that he took pride in was there were no ink pens at Allensworth as you see and as you use today. You had to have a little jar with some ink in it, and you had to have what they called either a quill pen, or sometimes they had new metal pens, and you had to apply just the right pressure to get the ink to write with, because if you pressed it too hard, you would flood ink all over your paper and you'd have to start all over again. So that was a skill that he developed at Allensworth, and he said that made his work just shine over everybody else's, because he could handle that period with skill and it looked good. But he said that he was on the job, and this flyer came across his desk saying that the state was looking for sites that met this certain criteria. And he says, you know, I think Allensworth fits that criteria. And he talked to some people, my mother being one of them, and they agreed, and they got started with their committees, advisory boards, and everything. And you see today the 22 museums that are displayed at Colonel Allensworth State Historic Park, because of the idea that Mr. Pope saw and kind of figured out that Allensworth met that criteria. So that's why I say he's the person that's really responsible for Allensworth being here today. He's deceased at this moment right now. Let's see, I think that the other thing that I needed to let you know is that my mother's family came to Bakersfield in 1881, and her daddy's family, my granddaddy, their family came in 1885. And my grandfather has his land grant in 1885 for the property that he bought out on Pacheco and South H. And that, and all of the girls, all of his family, everybody, the girls and boys were all born here in California. So at one time we had 5 generations of Californians in our family that were still alive. Most people are from the South or other places, but not California. And I was kind of proud, well, I was proud of that, very much so. Something else I need to tell you about my mother. Well, she lived to be 100. That's one of the things I wanted to share with you. And they moved here in Allensworth in 1909, and they left in 1918 because of the water problems. However, they enjoyed being in Allensworth, and my grandfather was a person who people called a race man. And he was a person that I don't want you to think that only race men were only African Americans. There were race men. You might have a couple here today. But there were people, these were men that were leaders, and they took the initiative to see that things got done. And they had their own ideas and opinions about how things should be done. And usually they got their way, or they could convince other people that this was the right thing to do. And anyway, my family really enjoyed living in Allensworth, and they hated to come back to Bakersfield under the conditions that they did, but they survived. And I want to let you know that each one of you need to pick up this brochure before you leave. And if you go to the website on the back, I need you to take down some additional information. It's www.parks.cal.gov, G-O-V. I will repeat that. It's www.parks.cal.gov. And then scroll down to the name of the park, and it will be Allensworth. And then go to the place that says schools, and it will talk about teachers. And you can download a piece of the world, and it goes along with the video that you saw. It's free, but you download it, and that's how you get it, is to follow those prompts. Do I need to say it one more time? No. But this is a teacher's guide with a student's resource and lesson plans in here.
Okay. Would be Josie, again, after you talked about your family and whatnot, could you explain to the students who might not know who Booker T. Washington was and what he stood for and what he was trying to create? Because I think that missed opportunity to build a black college at Allensworth was really significant, and it might have flown over some of the students' heads. But if you could sort of say again, what was the vision of what Allensworth could have been? What was the vision? Could you share a little bit about that?
Well, Booker T. Washington was a person who believed, and so did Colonel Allensworth, that everyone should be educated to the hilt. As much as you can gain, you need to be educated and to be self-sufficient so you could take care of yourself and take care of somebody else. But also, most of the time, a learned person treats you differently than a person who does not know their history. Do you know your history? Most people don't. And it makes a difference as how you walk, how you talk, the pictures that you put on your walls, and the people you associate with. It also is at that time, because there were not a lot of institutions that actually accepted black students to learn from their information they had. And that is one of the reasons black colleges were built in the South. So they had to teach their own. And that idea was one of the reasons Colonel Allensworth wanted to find some land, build the town, and educate you not only for survival, but to understand the politics. In the book, I talk about how my grandfather's house used to be the area where people would come to ask him about political things. When an issue would come up, it wasn't anything for my grandfather to be talking to people, telling them the pros and cons about it. He would actually tell you, the whole class, if you ask him a question, he would tell you the person to watch, which white man you could trust, and which white man you could not trust, and which black would go and tell everything you did. So yes, so he really stood up for people's rights. And that's what a race man does. Whatever is supposed to be the letter of the law, you need to follow it. Don't pay me some money to do something wrong. And these men really took care of business. So to have a college near Allensworth or right in Allensworth, this was higher ed. These children were really going to be smart, and they were going to be the ones who would take care of other little towns and develop an idea that would be good for everyone.
Students, raise your hand if you have a question, and feel free to ask it. Anyone have any questions for Mrs. Strickland?
The white race, when was when they started introducing themselves to the black community?
You coming out of slavery? Is that what you're
Do you mean in Allensworth?
Yeah. Like,
I guess maybe the question that she's asking is, did Allensworth have any kind of a relationship with the surrounding white community in that part of Tulare County at all?
Yes, because here, if you understand, even today, it's mostly the white man who has the product you need. They were the owners of the land. And things that they did, they would have to okay it with them. However, Mr. Over, who was the Justice of the Peace, and he was the first Justice of the first black Justice of the Peace in the state of California, he would be the one who would negotiate with the other men, and sometimes they would be in groups. Most of the time they went in groups. Most of the time they never traveled alone, which was dangerous because you could disappear. But yes, they would talk to the white men to see how they could bargain with them, compromise, let them know what they wanted. And that's what Colonel Allensworth had to prove to the nation and the world. Just give us a piece of the world and let us prove that we can take care of ourselves and live in dignity and pride just like you, the white man.
I want to take, again, initiative, and I have to ask Josie to educate at least my students on this. We spent a lot of time talking about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We've talked a lot about state violence against African Americans in the Jim Crow era. From your own knowledge or memory, family stories from Allensworth, how safe was Allensworth, particularly in that part of California?
At that time, in the little towns were white people, and they were Confederates. They were not too safe. And that is one of the reasons that Colonel Allensworth wanted the Buffalo Soldiers to come and stay there, because these were men, and all of them knew, they all owned ammunition, and they knew how to handle it. Nobody was going to mess with the Buffalo Soldiers. Even the Indians didn't bother them. They said they had more, they didn't say it like this, but they had more guts than anybody else. They wouldn't even, the Indians wouldn't even fight some people that the Buffalo Soldiers went in and fought.
And for those students who might not know what a Buffalo Soldier was besides a song by Bob Marley, would you tell us?
Buffalo Soldiers were coined by the Indians. Yes, they were the ones that used the term of the dark soldiers were like buffalo. They said there's a patch on the buffalo where the hair is really close knitted. We call it kinky. And they said that they had this hair like the buffalo, and they have the strength and the stamina of the buffalo. And so many of the tribes wanted the buffalo soldiers with them, just like during World War II, when these pilots did not want the African American pilots to go with them to war in Europe, and these white units went out, they got killed, they lost their planes, and every time the black group from Tuskegee, Alabama went out, they never lost a plane in battle. Till all of a sudden, the white aviation gentleman said, I'm not going over there and fight with that platoon no more unless you give me the escort of the Tuskegee Airmen. And that was the same concept with the Buffalo Soldiers. They didn't back down from anything.